wrap up. In preparing for this panel, we had a number of discussions that were with a much broader group than is on the panel. And we talked about, okay, what are the challenges and how are you going to overcome them? And so I just wanted to touch on a few so that you get the wisdom of people who aren't here today. And obviously funding, but we don't need to stress that anymore. One of the things that I think everyone agreed was with all these projects, there's a lot of project-specific challenges, very specific challenges. Challenges like Margaret was saying, hers was on the gardener's snake. It might be historical resources, it might be endangered species, it might be cultural resources. So, and what's important about that is that if you don't have someone who's a champion and a dedicated manager, what everyone around the table was saying, that a good idea will just drop because you almost need a maniacal problem solver, someone who is so goal-driven on solving problems and understands how to form partnerships. And I think everyone around the table, because we had a couple of groups on this, they said that that was almost the most important thing above even funding. That if you didn't have someone like an Eileen or a Marguerite or any one of these folks, it would die in the water. And they were talking about like the personality of the project manager. They have to never take no, be there every day, pound on the table, whatever. And that's what they told us. And so that was one thing that came out really strong. Another thing that came out from more than just Portrayal was this need for political support locally and the landowners, that's a really key thing. And if people don't understand that, they won't get very far if they don't have that. On the permitting, maybe these are more solutions than barriers. We know that permitting is always a challenge. So what we talked about is, okay, given that's a challenge, don't whine about it. What are you going to do about it? And so here were some of the lessons. People said that, look, no matter what you think about what the permitting agencies want, just listen carefully, understand what they're saying, and just do it. Just do it. Don't fuss with them. And that was something that people around the table said. Don't fuss with them. Listen, understand, and just move forward. They said to acknowledge that permitting agencies have way too much on their plate, and that if you ever have the financial resources to help them with their work and hire someone to help them with their work, that's another key that many people found successful. The third thing is sort of understanding and then mitigating the fact that the agency DNA is really risk-averse, and it's around scientific uncertainty, and it's around a culture we have in our public agencies that mistakes are sometimes focused on more than successes, personal, professional mistakes. And so our wisdom was that there's a cultural thing around risk aversion that our folks are saying that really gets in the way here. And then lastly, apart from beneficiary pays, we found that with projects that have a lot of infrastructure by them, county roads, state roads, gas line, trains, whatever, that makes that project all the more daunting because you have to work around all those things. And so I've been recently in on some meetings with some of the urban water agencies trying to figure out, what kind of levies might be a good thing. And when they look at the audience, they go, man, this one doesn't have a lot of infrastructure on it. Let's try that one. Because they know that every piece of infrastructure is going to be a nightmare. And so that's another thing that they talked about. I guess I would ask the panel now, were there any challenges? I mean, we've had lots of discussions around this. We've been discussing this since January 22nd, preparing for this panel. Are there any barriers or challenges you don't think we covered? Because we've been probably in 6 hours of meetings preparing for this panel. And so is there anything we missed, or anybody from the coalition, from the audience, that was in those meetings? Because Taryn said, talk straight with us, tell us the barriers, and tell us how you got over them. So I just wanted to open the floor for anyone. Go ahead, Marguerite.
Yeah, this is just one short one that it was a financial impact when we made the switch of where we were going to go next on our canal project, and we moved the segments because we were so far along. I estimate it's about $1 million impact that we basically had to pay out of our pocket to make that change because we had to go back to the permitting agencies, update the permits, update the bid package to go out for construction. All those kind of things added about $1 million on a $20 million project. So it wasn't huge, but the concept is we had to convince our board, and we were able to do so, that was worth it, because you can't really put a price tag on avoiding a conflict with a state agency like DWR. So, that was just, it was a financial thing, but we worked it out, and I think everybody was happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe this is the same as you were saying. Tell me if I'm wrong, but the carrying costs are really a big barrier, and that even if monies may be forthcoming from a public agency, the contractors who do this work want paid in 45 to 60 days. And that's been a real struggle because the money's there, but it's very difficult to get it out to the folks who are doing the work. And so because of that, we've talked to some RDs that won't do the work because they can't carry the costs, even though the money's there. It's been a huge problem, at least people at our table have told us so. Is that true? Yeah. So I don't know if anyone had anything else to add.
Just on that you can't recover the cost of interest that you have to pay to do that cash flow. Like Eileen will never see one dime in interest on that, and so you just have to account for it as a part of the project cost.
Anything else? Okay.
Randy.
So we'd like to have a discussion with you.
Phil? I'm going to read you some of my summaries of the composite testimony. Principles are, either all of you or some of you have said the following. Full or near full funding should come from the state or somebody other than us. Number 2, there should be no strings or not too many, and the state should pay the money to the locals in advance. Big impact projects should go first, except the really important smaller projects should go first. Full engagement of local interest, but really fast review and approval by state agencies and no long delays. I mean, that's my experience with most human activity in the 50 years I've spent in public life, but all of those are prescriptions for delay. The one thing that a couple of you have said, if you have money yourself and are willing to spend it, you can do it fast. Contra Costa Water District, although loving to get reimbursement if they could and wanting to get payment for the Los Vaqueros Reservoir, spent their own money and got it done. They get miles of credit from that. The thing about this, the list, which the first 44 projects cost $828 million, with no mention of a cost-sharing ratio, except, was it Mr. Brown or somebody else who said it's $9 from the state and the feds and $1 from the locals? And then 21 additional projects now added to this blue list, which is the total cost of what, Ms. Sherry? Just estimate. I understand it's ballpark.
Well, I think I'm going to defer that to maybe Jonas, who's been doing this.
I'm just guessing $1 billion at least.
Yeah.
Jonas is nodding $1 billion. I mean, the problem is we start, and this is the practical problem, and I'm as guilty of it as you are. We start with what we want to get done, and we want an easy way to do it rapidly. And the question for us at the council, and we're going to do it on levy investment strategies for the state, is what are the public purposes that should be served and in what order, and what standards should apply on investments. We know from the studies of the Public Policy Institute of California that when you add up all the money that's spent for operations, for maintenance, for capital improvements on water, wastewater, and flood control in California, the average total amount of spending is 84 to 86% from local agencies, 12% from the state, 4% of all of that category from the federal government. But the debates here are always first about state money. I understand why. And I think it's helpful that you're wrestling with how to address what are the amorphous policy statutory goals of the state, the co-equal goals. And I predict 5 years from now there will be far more sophisticated arguments and methodologies to approach. But I still don't see a priority listing of these because you haven't been able to wrestle more successfully than we have, although we have a statutory mandate, by the way, to promote interconnected habitats with significant acreage because our science and the law says that those are more likely than not to lead to habitat and species benefits. That's an operating principle, but I bet you a lot of money that if we took Mr. Katz's suggestion, big projects with a lot of potential benefits should go before everything else, that would lose a lot of interest from others. How can rational decisions be made when even well-intentioned people now have spent 2.5 years putting together a list of projects where the principles are less clear or no more clear than they are for us? Ms. Sherry?
I guess I just want to take you on for a second, Phil, because I think around the strings attached and the funding, I guess because I've been sitting through these conversations for 2 months, I don't think that people are whining about funding and strings attached. I think instead, or at least I've seen the evolution, and that is that people have sort of come to terms with the reality and are trying to figure out creative ways around it. At least that's the experience I have with the group we're working on, that they know those things, but I guess I don't want to come off that people are saying no strings, we don't have funding, pay money back to us. They're all struggling with how to do that and actually have come up with a lot of creative ways around that. So I just wanted to set the record straight for that. And I think we've told you before that part of keeping the coalition together was not setting priorities, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to get as big of a list together for you all and for other government agencies so that we only could do our part. And we as in a collaborative process knew that if we start picking priorities, we would bust the coalition up. So everyone has their role to play in this, and so that's our role. And so I just needed to say that.
Yeah, and if I could as well. I know you've been doing this for a long time, Mr. Eisenberg, but as far as what you picked out of the presentation, it clearly seemed like an over-cynical approach to what we were saying.
Mr. Brown, who did I misquote? Who did not make the argument I've stated?
I didn't say anything about $9 for every
I don't think it's
$1.
bad. I don't think it's hostile. I don't think it's irresponsible to do these kinds of things. But you can't simultaneously expect a governmental agency to not set articulated principles that you may not agree with.
But I don't think that's what we're saying.
We didn't indicate that at all.
Well, then
what we have here
then let me just make a suggestion to you. The state law says the co-equal goals of water reliability for California and habitat protection improvement in the Delta. Half of these projects are flood control, which may have an impact. The expansions or modifications in the Yolo bypass are an illustration, but many of them don't. They just happen to be projects, good on their own terms, a benefit to local people. But as Mr. Johnston said earlier, if the benefit is primarily to local interest, it's a harder reach to argue the state ought to pay a lion's share. The Delta's always benefited in flood areas from having very low local cost shares.
So are you saying that the projects that have been identified here, Mr. Katz's project, is just flood control oriented, or the projects that are included in this list of 12 projects, it's just flood control oriented? Because the majority of those are focused on fish benefits as well as flood benefits, agricultural sustainability, basically the multi-benefit projects that we hear the Delta Plan is encouraging, the Delta Stewardship is encouraging, and we've got something going on here where you have locals who are actually deciding, hey, we want to create some fish habitat. We want to figure out what we can do to create fish habitat, and we want to move that forward. And we're a little frustrated with the process. Everyone gets frustrated with the permitting process, but how often do you have locals actually moving projects forward that benefit fish and habitat and restoration?
Well, I'll give you an example, then I'll stop with questions. I think a state decision on funding for things like Delta Plan, the Governor's Water Action Plan, and so on. If you specified activities within the Delta, logically would do something like this. It would say the broad stretch of land starting on the west with the Yolo bypass leading to the eastern areas, which go through Liberty, McCormick, Williamson, over to the Meadows, and then over to the habitat preservation lands beyond Interstate 5, offers the opportunity for vast corridors of connected habitat with tangential benefits, earmark some money, and let people argue about it. But of course, that writes out, that gives a priority to an identified policy pursuit that makes it less likely that other projects would be funded. And I understand why a coalition of diverse groups cannot set priorities because the losers threaten to leave or do leave. Mm-hmm. But it is the setting of priorities that gives consistency, understandable terms, focus, and some half-assed chance of expeditious action.
And that's government's role. I mean, that's how we have seen it. It's really government's role to set the priority, and we're trying to set the table a little bit. That's all.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. I think what we wanted to do with this panel is to highlight some successes and to help us understand from your experiences where the challenges lie. And you've all done a really good job of that. Mm-hmm. The one thing, Susan, in your summary, and then I feel as the chairman I'm losing control when audience members start coming up to the table.
Well, but Jonas is one of the inviters, you know.
But bear with me. Susan, one of the things in your summary that you didn't touch on is the need for a master plan or a strategic plan. And in the conversations that you had in anticipation of this presentation, in the Yolo bypass, for example, was that an issue that came up about the need to have
a master plan for the Delta you're talking about? No.
or for levees or for the Yolo bypass or something like that? Was that one of the impediments to moving?
Well, you know, I think I sort of probably pushed people more on the ground obstacles and solutions for them because we pretty much went to there. And so we didn't get into the larger planning issues, but in other conversations we brought them up. But maybe other people can chime in.
Well, my perception, and I'm not going to make a lot of friends on the coalition, a whole lot of the projects that we looked at are fix-it projects. The Delta's always going to be like that. There's too much to do there. There's a lot to do. We have to maintain the infrastructure. And you could always, and many of them add in enhancement, ecological enhancement aspects, but they're basically fix-it projects, and that's a whole lot of money. They don't directly address the co-equal goal of ecosystem enhancement. Our group has been very reluctant to make that differentiation in identifying these projects for the reasons you mentioned before.
And also the near-term nature of them. See, our thing was that, okay, what can you get done in 5 years or 7 years? So it wasn't as much the master, because one of our things was get it done now. Just do something rather than just sit here and be upset. So that near-term sense, I think, precluded some of the long-term thinking, but other people should chime in.
If I may, Jonas mentioned with the Planning Conservation League,